In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. Direct, O Lord, all our actions by thy holy inspirations, and carry them on by thy gracious assistance, so that every prayer and work of ours may begin from thee, and by thee be happily unto Christ our Lord. Mary, Queen of the Angels, pray for us. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Amen. This conference is about apparitions, locutions, and private revelation, essentially. And what we want to do is talk about the criteria. There's three parts of this conference. The first is the criteria for judging whether something's authentic. The second one is why you have to be careful in judging these things, because of the fact that demons can cause certain things. And we want to talk about what they can actually do in this area. And then the last thing is some prudential considerations about certain apparitions. Okay. The church, when the magisterium in the church was given a specific charism. Now, a charism is something that's gratuitously given, but in this particular case, the charism is given to the magisterium of the church. When it was given by Christ, when he ascended, he said, "All power in heaven and earth has been given to me. Go therefore and baptize all nations." It's generally conceded by the fathers that at that time Christ gave them, and also at Pentecost, Christ infused in the apostles specifically, and then it gets passed on by virtue of office later to those who follow upon them as bishops. The church, that Christ gave to the apostles the ability to discern spirits. Now, being an exorcist, I cannot tell you how many times someone has come up to me and says, "Father, I have the gift of discernment of spirits," and by the time it's over with, I'm pulling my hair out. Because, in fact, my experience is, in all of the people that have told me that they had the gift of discernment of spirits, not one had the authentic gift. Not one. I did know a woman who did have it, but she never claimed it. And the way I knew she actually had it is you'd ask her, something just came up about a case that I was working on, and she said, "Oh yeah," and then she named where the demons were located, what their names were, which there's no way she could have known any of that, but she was accurate. What how they got in, how you're going to get them out, and what they were sensitive to. After that, we asked her a few more times, and she was never wrong. Never. If it's an authentic gift from God, they can see it. What many people misinterpret as a discernment of spirits is they get an emotional feeling in relationship to something, or there is what's called an acquired discernment of spirits, that when you're around something and you learn how it functions, you can look at it and say, it's probably X. One of the exorcists that taught me, he has the acquired gift of discernment of spirits. I had him take a look at a case a couple of years ago, and he said that this is rooted in something connected to the Father. About a month later, we found out, boom, he was right on. But he doesn't claim to have the gift. He just could look at this, and from his experience from the past, he could say, it seems like this is what it's going to be. And I think sometimes people misinterpret that. Like I said, most of the people who ask, say, I've got the discernment of spirits, most of the time they're just wrong. You could flip a coin and probably be more accurate. All right. The discernment of spirits, or the discernment of even apparitions, can never be based upon your emotions. Why? Because demons have access to your imagination, your memory, your emotions, and your what's called the cogitative power. It's the ability to get, that's the thing in your mind that puts perspective on certain things and makes associations. They have access to that. So sometimes people will say, well, I'm feeling, I just instantaneously tune out. And the reason being is because of the fact that the demons have access to that, and they can actually make people feel certain things in relationship to certain things and give you false information. The church, of course, has an objective set of criteria. When it discerns, even though it has the gift of discernment, which basically means it's a specific grace, which normally the bishop does due diligence when he comes time to judge the apparition, Our Lady will make sure that he receives the grace to know that it's authentic. Anytime you hear someone say, what are you going to do if the bishop says no? They'll say, well, he's an evil man, so I don't get it. I don't buy that he's going to say, so I'm just going to keep believing in this apparition. You've already got a spirit of disobedience right there, but there's also another issue. It doesn't matter if the man is evil. It really doesn't. It's the office. It's the grace flowing through the office that makes the determination, that gives him the grace to see whether something's authentic or not his holiness, or not if you happen to like him or think he's a good bishop. That's not the issue. The one who has the right by canon law to judge whether an apparition or locution or something is authentic is the local bishop, not the Pope. Now, it's true that the Pope does have that authority, but he's granted it to the bishops, and the only time that we would not pay attention to what the bishop has judged is if the Holy Father himself, Rome, derogates it to themselves to say, no, we're going to look at it ourselves. So that otherwise, you always follow what the bishop, because everyone thinks, well, the only time we could really know is if the Pope says it. No, that's not true. If the bishop makes a judgment about it, then you know it's not the case. Okay. If he... No, he has. He does. In fact, he's doing it right now in relationship to Medjugorje. Because there's been 3 bishops that have consistently said there's nothing supernatural happening here. They have, and so what most people don't realize is that when Rome decided to take a look at it, initially it was not to make a judgment about whether it was authentic or not. It was to determine whether the bishops had met the canonical requirements for its proper adjudication. Later, though, on the panel, in the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith that looked at it, the entire panel did not think it was authentic. The only people who thought it was, except for 3, which were the Franciscans involved in it. So this is something which, when the Holy Father comes out with it, I think it'll probably put an rest to it as to whether it's authentic or not. Okay, so he does do it, but rarely. Usually they just leave it to the local bishop. So but the church, when it judges this stuff, there is an objective criteria that the church uses to judge whether an apparition is authentic or not. So it's not just like the bishop just sits there and goes and prays and says it's not authentic. That's not how it works. There's an actual procedure that's actually done. They do an investigation. They get everything put together. A dossier is gotten together, and then the bishop takes a look at it. And there's some objective criteria, and that's what we want to talk about, at least initially. The first is any revelation contrary to dogma or morals must be rejected as false. If there is ever anything said contrary to authentic Catholic teaching, it is de facto a sign that the revelation is false. This is a very key point, because a lot of times, in fact, this is usually the way that most bishops realize this is a little wacky. Right. So, if there's anything contrary to church teaching, it's not the case, because God, if God is the cause of the revelation, he's not going to contradict himself. The next is that any revelation contrary to the common teaching of theologians or purporting to settle an argument among the schools of theology is gravely suspect. Now that has to be, unless you know a lot of theology, you're going to get that thing completely wrong. Well, wait a minute, there's all sorts of weird theologians who say X, Y, and Z. We're not talking about that. The term theologians refers to, more specifically and formally, in Tuus Libenter, the document Tuus Libenter by Pius IX, it refers to the theologians, which the church has always said that if the fathers of the church, that is from the time of the death of the last apostle until roughly 800 more or less, if they were unanimous on something being of the faith, it was infallible, that it was of the faith, and if you didn't believe it, you weren't Catholic, regardless of whether the magisterium had defined it or not. Then they said the same, Pius the Ninth says, the same thing applies to what he calls the theologians, which is those of the theological schools like the Dominican school, the Franciscan school, from the time of about 1100 to 1750. If they're unanimous that something is of the faith, then de facto, you must believe it in order to be Catholic. However, if they don't say that something is necessarily of the faith, but they all pretty much agree on something, then if you don't hold to that, your position is temerarious. In other words, it's dangerous and you're likely to fall into heresy. So the church is, one of the criteria they'll look at is if the theologians had kind of this general opinion that this is basically the way this works, and all of a sudden this came flatly out against it, it's unlikely that the apparition is authentic. If some detail or other is in a revelation is false, it is not necessary to reject the entire revelation. The remainder may be authentic. Now that's a very important point. It's possible that there's something in the revelation that's not quite accurate, but that in the end, the rest of it is actually authentic. This also includes the fact that sometimes the visionary or the seer, the person who hears the locations, will hear or see something, but then when they report it, now normally speaking, God gives them a grace to report it with perfect accuracy. You see this, for example, at Fatima, the seers at Fatima. You also see this in the case of La Salette, that there was a very consistent, that the accuracy was something that was very clear. You see this especially with at Lourdes. Bernadette didn't even know what the words meant, but she gave them accurately each time. So there's a specific grace. However, once in a while, in something that's not essential to the vision, the person might interpret the thing and not get it exactly right. So sometimes you have to find out, well, what did you see? And that's maybe different from how the person who has it has interpreted it. The fact that a prophecy is fulfilled, now a prophecy is the prediction of something in the future, in this particular case, is fulfilled, is not of itself conclusive proof that the revelation was from God. In other words, it's one of those that if something is predicted and the opposite happens, then you know that the revelation isn't the case. So, for example, if in an apparition the people were told that this particular location would enjoy an era of peace and then civil war breaks out, well, then you know there's probably something not quite right with the apparition. However, just because they say that this might happen doesn't give you an infallible indication that this is actually true. Why? Because demons, who are far more intelligent than we are, they understand causes and how causes interrelate and how causes bring about certain effects to a much higher degree than we do. So they can look at a set of circumstances, because everything that occurs in the materially created order is infused in their minds as it happens. Now they can only focus on one thing at a time, but it's all there. So they can look at all the different contingencies and all the different things that are going into a situation and realize this is where this thing is headed, and so that they can predict it, whereas human beings would have no clue that that's actually where it's headed. So just because a prophecy is fulfilled does not necessarily mean that it's authentic. On the other hand, if there's a prediction and it's clearly false, then it's likely that the apparition is not the case. Revelation concerning merely curious or useless matters may be rejected as not divine. In other words, if they're getting involved in certain things that have no impact on people's salvation or the good of people, then you probably know it's not the case. The same can be said, and this is according to Jordan Allman, which is actually very consistent among the spiritual writers who study this. They're very consistent in saying this next line. The same is to be said of those who are of those apparitions which are detailed, lengthy, and filled with a superfluity of proofs and reason. Now that's a very important criteria. Why do we know this to be the case? Well, let's take a look at Our Lady. If you look in Scripture about her character, she had the virtue of silence. She had it. There's hardly any words she spoke in the whole time, and they were always clear, concise, and to the point. She's not a woman who's just going to appear and just and just keep repeating herself over and over. She's just not. That's just not what she does. In all the authentic apparitions which we've seen in the past, there's a lead up. There might be some apparition of an angel or something. She appears. She's quick. She's to the point, and it's over. Whereas this stuff that's just going on and on and on and on and on is generally considered probably diabolic, probably, or human, because you can actually have human beings who actually think that they are receiving visions when they're not. And it's not necessarily diabolic either. Divine revelations are generally brief, clear, and concise. Now that clarity and conciseness is a very important point. One of the problems that I run across from time to time with people when they're interpreting certain kinds of they're giving certain kinds of interpretations to certain things is they'll extrapolate from it and then say, well, this is what Our Lady said, and it's an extrapolation. That is not how apparitions are ever to be read, ever. They're always to be read in what's called the formal sense, which means that Our Lady, or whatever the case, says exactly what she intends to say, no more and no less, and precisely as she says it. The person who receives revelation, so does the content of the revelation, then the second you have to take a look at the individual giving the content. The person who receives the revelation should be examined carefully, especially as to temperament and character. If the person is humble, well-balanced, discreet, evidently advanced in virtue, and enjoys good mental and physical health, then there is good reason to proceed further and to examine the revelation itself. So if you look at Bernadette, she wasn't very knowledgeable, but she's very balanced, very clear, very concise, discreet, etc. And so obviously this is the case. But if the individual is exhausted with excessive mortifications, suffers nervous affliction, is subject to periods of exhaustion or great depression, or is eager to divulge the revelation, and that's one of the key things. Most of the people who have received authentic revelations have absolutely no desire to talk about it. In fact, some of them have to be commanded by their superiors to write it down. Otherwise, they just don't want to deal with it. Whereas a person who's always going around and trying to make sure that everybody knows that they've received this. One time, when shortly after I was ordained, I showed up to fill in for a priest, and I'm walking up to go into the sanctuary, and this woman kind of cuts me off, and she says, the first words of her, I don't even know this woman from Eve. And she says, I've seen Jesus and Mary. Good for you. I'm happy that you've seen them. All right. So in other words, if you see those things, there's cause for doubt. In other words, you have to kind of take a look at the character of the individual. So those are kind of the objective criteria. Why is this criteria important? Well, part of it has to do with the fact that demons can actually be the cause of certain kinds of activity that can be very close to what appears to be an authentic apparition. And we want to go into those a little bit. The first is that they are capable of producing corporeal and imaginative visions. What does that mean? It means that they can actually cause externally to the individual, or in their senses, a change in, they can cause this change or a vision, like creating a hologram, so to speak. They can create this externally to the individual so that the individual actually thinks that it's there. Or they can put it in the imagination and give the person the impression that they're actually seeing something real. They can actually cause that. They can't give what's called intellectual visions, which is part of that, the immaterial part of our intellect, because there's different parts. We have a spiritual part to our intellect that has a capacity for self-reflection and abstract thought. That part, they can't cause visions in that part, but only in our imagination and only in our senses or externally to us. They can produce rays of light in the body and sensible heat. In other words, they can make it look like the person's glowing, so there must be divine. No, demons can cause that. They can falsify ecstasy. This is one of the reasons why when the church is testing people during apparitions, there may be certain things that the doctors do to them, like they might poke the person, they might take their pulse, they might check to see if there's any dilation of the eyes. That is to make sure that it's not being falsified, that the apparition isn't just being faked by the individual himself. It does not mean that if the eyes don't dilate, or if they poke the person, they don't react, that it's therefore authentic, because the demons can shut down bodily functions in that area and make it look like the person's in ecstasy. So it doesn't mean that just because that happens that, but the church is just trying to do in that case is just rule out any kind of human spirit being the source of the apparition. They can cause sensible consolations and tenderness. This is a very important point, because a lot of times people will come to me and they'll say, Father, I need you to tell me if what you think I experienced was from God or not. Okay, let's hear it. Well, one day I was standing in front of the Blessed Sacrament. I just got this overwhelming sense of peace and consolation, and I was just looking at this, and I just really loved God, and it felt so good. Do you think that's from God? I don't know. I mean, it could be. St. John of the Cross says that if you experience those things, you make use of them to get closer to God, so that if the demon is doing it, he's kind of thwarted and he doesn't like it, so he'll stop anyway. But the demons can cause that. Now, how do you know that they've caused a sensible consolation? If it's from God, it will bring about greater virtue in the individual and peace and some kind of a purification. If it's from the demons, it'll usually bring around aridity and difficulty in obedience and things of that sort. The next is demons can instantaneously cure sickness that has been caused by diabolic influence. There are certain people who think I have the gift of healing. I don't have anything of the sort. I have nothing like that. People say, what gift do you have? Presuming that everybody's got I don't have any of that stuff. I tell people, I'm a grinder. What do you mean? Well, when I get a case of diabolic possession, I just got to grind it out. And so, but I do know some priests who have an authentic gift of discernment. Like I know one priest that had one, but he might have died already. But he could just kneel next to somebody and pray in front of the Blessed Sacrament and say, this is what you have to do, and he would give them something or tell them something, and boom, it was always right? I don't have that kind of thing. I think it's actually a good thing I don't have that kind of thing, because one of the things my goal is to actually write a book on the objective criteria that we need to recoup in this area, because too many people are getting involved in the subjective side of things and the feelings of things when demons can have influence in it. All right. So I don't have the gift of healing. What I can do is I can say minor exorcisms or even solemn, and as a result of that, if the illness is being caused from a diabolic cause, it will stop and the person will recoup on their own, usually very quickly. That's all that means. But it just means, though, that you have to be careful like this. This person was healed. Yeah, but there's different kinds of healing. One of the things the demons can't do, for example, is suppose somebody doesn't have an arm or their arm's been cut off. The demons cannot restore the totality of their arm because that requires creation, so they can't do that. Because demons can't create a substance, they can't create something. But they can, if the person is like really sick, all of a sudden the person feels, I've been healed, and then there's a change, and then they feel better. They can do those kinds of things. They can produce the stigmata and other kinds of bodily extraordinary phenomenon, like the appearance of crowns around people's heads or the stigmata in the hands or things of this sort. So just because someone has a stigmata doesn't mean they're from God. This is one of the reasons why even the Church, the Vatican, sent an investigator, which you can actually read the book now. It's put out by Ignatius Press, which is it's quite a good book, I think, actually, generally speaking. They did a full investigation of Padre Pio, and in the end, the guy just said, look, there's no reason to believe this guy isn't having an authentic stigmata because of the fact that he's a simple, humble individual, etc. So he didn't see any indication that there was any kind of falsification occurring. But the demons can do that. They can cause the stigmata. They can also cause extraordinary phenomenon dealing with physical objects, such as crowns or rings and things of this sort. They can simulate miracles. They can make it look like it's miraculous when it's actually not. And they can cause phenomena such as levitation. Just because someone levitates during an apparition doesn't mean it's authentic, because demons can cause that. Or, just because of the fact that it looks like the person is receiving Holy Communion because something appears on their tongue, etc., doesn't mean that that's necessarily authentic, because the demons can cause that vision even to other people standing around. They can simulate bilocation, which is not obviously an authentic case of bilocation, but they can simulate it, making it seem like someone appeared in another location. They can simulate compenetration or make it appear like there's what's called compenetration of bodies, where it looks like something passes through the individual. Now, this is a very important thing, because I don't know if you've been watching the YouTubes, but there's two kinds of videos that are being uploaded on YouTube. There's those who are doing it by a sleight of hand. It looks like magic that the person sticks this thing through their hand and they pull it out. It looks like it's authentic, but it's actually not. It's just a sleight of hand. It's a form of deception. But there's a few people that are using diabolic mediation in order to actually do those kinds of things. So I don't suggest you sit around watching them as a matter of curiosity. All right. Demons can cause persons or objects to disappear from sight by placing an obstacle in the line of the vision or acting directly on the sense of sight. They can transport them too. From time to time, people will call me to their house, and stuff in their house is appearing and disappearing. They can simulate locution by means of sound waves or immediate action on the sense of hearing, or they can even act upon the person's imagination so that they actually think they're hearing something. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they're having something if they're authentic, if they're hearing it. This is why, because demons can do this, you have to shift to an objective criteria. Is it contrary to what the church teaches? Is it contrary to what the theologians say? Is it contrary to what the church normally understands by how things work spiritually, etc.? That has to be the objective criteria in judging it. They can cause a person to speak in tongues. There are three kinds of, quote, speaking in tongues. And this is something that every time I say this, there's always pain in the audience in someone's case. But I'll say it anyway. There's three kinds, and this is what the authors say. The first is the authentic kind, which if you look in Scripture, it's broken down into two kinds. The first is you speak what your language, and the other person hears theirs. We saw this with St. Peter. He went out, he preached, and everybody heard their own language. The second is that God infuses in the individual the knowledge of the language so that when they speak it, they actually know what they're speaking. There is a systematic misinterpretation of one of the parts of St. Paul about the gift of tongues in which they mistranslate it even. They say, that in the mistranslation, they say, he says, my tongue speaks, but my intellect contributes nothing, is one of the translations I saw. That's not at all what it says. If you actually look at the Latin, which is the only version that the church actually authenticates, but even if you look in the Greek, it's very clear. St. Paul says, I don't derive any fruit from the gift of tongues. What's this fruit he's talking about? I don't get any new knowledge from it. Okay. Now, the gift of tongues does give you the knowledge to actually speak the language. The counterpart, the diabolic counterpart, trust me, I have seen this over and over and over and over again in session. The demon will insert himself, he speaks languages completely fluently, the person doesn't have a clue what's being spoken out of their mouth. That is, historically, that has always consistently been until the 1960s, when the Pentecostals had an influence in the Catholic Church, consistently that was the judgment, the principle upon which they judged whether the person had authentic gift of tongues. Did they understand the language or not? If they didn't, it's probably diabolic. This is one of the reasons why you have to be really careful with that. The third kind is the human form. Now, the human form, they've actually done scientific studies of it, which is strange. They're always investigating everything, it seems, these days. But what they did is they basically took people who would start speaking in tongues, and it wasn't from a diabolic cause, and it wasn't from an authentic cause, but what it was from themselves. And the way they knew it was they found out that what they were speaking in tongues, they broke it down and realized that they were following the same grammatical patterns that they did in their own personal habits of speech. So that in point of fact, it was just a human thing. Okay. The point being in all this is that the demons can actually cause a person to speak in tongues. They can produce bodily incombustibility by interposing some medium between the fire and the body of the individual. So, in other words, this is one of the reasons why when you're looking at an apparition, you have to be really careful about saying, well, they did this to it, it must be authentic. Yeah, look. There's a general principle. Now we shift to the prudential side of what we need to approach this on. The prudential side of it is because we are very blind and stupid when it comes to spiritual matters, and because as individuals we don't necessarily have the gift of discernment of spirits, and we may not even understand all the criteria, we are better off waiting until the church herself makes an official declaration about an apparition before we sign off on it. Now you can read it and look at it and say, yeah, it's probably the case, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you should wait, or I should say, you should suspend judgment until the church has made a judgment about it, whether it's authentic or not. This is important for two reasons. One, to keep detachment from it. Jordan Allman says in page 411 of his Spiritual Theology that you can come under the influence of the devil by the habitual practice of evil. Obviously, if you commit a lot of mortal sins, you're going to probably get whacked diabolically. So the habitual practice of evil, the seeking after charismatic graces, and seeking after extraordinary mystical phenomena. What does this mean concretely? It means that you shouldn't apparition chase. Every time there's some apparition, hey, did you hear about Our Lady's appearing down here? Yeah, they go over here. Next thing you know, it's over here, so they run over here. The next thing you know, these people are just running around in circles, right? So that in point in fact, what we should do is just simply, because we don't know if these are authentic. In fact, in the United States itself, there's been cases where the church has condemned particular kind of apparitions that people feel tenaciously hold on to. What happens is when we have a love for Our Lady, if we're not careful, people can actually seek after trying to be around in the place where she appeared so they can feel some kind of closeness to her, or to get something because they want to experience something on a supernatural level, rather than just grinding out their spiritual life in the day-to-day life. So what happens is when people start adoration chasing, but you can come under diabolic influence that way. But that means that we should wait until the church judges, because demons can be influenced in this area. We should wait until the church judges it, and that means we should have a certain level of detachment from any particular apparition until the church makes a judgment about it, so that when it occurs, we can accept it with ease and obedience. There's one particular apparition I've talked to people, well, what are you going to do if the church says no to it? Well, then I know that I know the Pope is wrong, or I know that the bishop's wrong, and I'm still going to believe it. That's dangerous grounds. In fact, disobedience in any kind of an ambiance of an apparition is a bad sign. So prudentially, we should wait until the judgment of the church. Now, on another prudential level, however, if it becomes clear that Our Lady is appearing someplace, I think a person should take reasonable means to get to know what she's saying. Now, we don't have an obligation for the sake of our salvation to believe in any private revelation, whether it's Fatima or Lourdes or La Salette or Akita or Betania or whatever it is. It doesn't really, you don't have any obligation to believe any of it, and you can still save your soul. So that's true. Because it's private revelation, we're only bound by public revelation, which is what ended with the death of the last apostle. However, I think it's pretty stupid not to pay attention to it. Even though you're not required to, prudence would seem to say, look, if Our Lady's showing up and telling us, hey, we should pay a little bit of attention, Our Lady's taking the time to come over and make a visitation, so we should take a look at it. This is one of the reasons why I think, given other things, given the fact, once you kind of have a good solid knowledge of all the areas of the Catholic faith, then you can maybe spend time investigating the various apparitions. I'm a little nervous when people spend all their time reading, about Marian apparitions, but they don't even know their basic catechism. But the point is that we should take some time to investigate it. Why did Our Lady appear at Fatima? Because she told us, I want the Pope to consecrate Russia to my Immaculate Heart, because and so that Russia doesn't spread its errors. Our culture is absolutely permeated with the errors of Russia. Feminism comes right from Lenin. He was the one who started all that nonsense, other than Eve, of course, with her rebellion. But you got the whole thing of the feminist movement. You got the whole thing now of the entitlement program. Entitlement program is just a form of communism. People think that they should get paid for doing nothing. That's what communism is. Also, being sloppy at work, that's communism. Why? Because of the fact that Look, for example, I don't know if you've noticed this, but a lot of the younger kids coming up have absolutely no attention to detail, and they could care less because they're still getting their paycheck. They don't care. And that's exactly what happens in communism. In communism, you're going to get your paycheck whether you do a good job or not. So that's why they're sloppy. That's why they have a lot of problems over there. But you just go through our whole culture, a variety of different things in our culture. The fact that, the idea that the government should be in charge of so much of the stuff within our culture violates the principle of subsidiarity, which is, again, a communist problem. So our culture, and quite frankly, worldwide, it's completely permeated from it. So this is something to realize that, okay, look, Our Lady was warning us against something. If you don't do this, you're going to pay a price for it. So, and there's some apparitions that unfortunately the church doesn't really gain us access to. People say, well, wouldn't you like to know what's in the full secret of the third secret of Fatima? Without getting into that whole discussion. And I just said, I would forego knowing anything about the third secret of Fatima if I could read just one apparition, just one, which 99% of the people don't even know about. It's called, it was when Our Lady appeared to Bruno at the Tre Fontani in Rome, which is where St. Paul had his head cut off and it bounced 3 times and the springs came up. When she appeared there in 1947, which was 30 years after Fatima, she appeared to a guy who was vehemently anti-Catholic. He was a Mason. He was preparing a speech for the Freemasons against Our Lady. She appeared to the children at first in a cave because he saw the children go into the cave, and when he went into the cave, they were kneeling there looking. He says, "What are you doing?" And then all of a sudden she appears to him, converts him on the spot, and then chronicles everything that's going to happen in the life of the church in the near future. So what happens? The Roman authorities get the thing. They give approbation to the apparition and bury it. It's buried deeper than the third secret of Fatima. Now we know it's connected to Fatima in some way because on the 33rd anniversary of on the 33rd anniversary of the apparition at the Tre Fontani in 1980, they have this on video in archives, but you can't get access to it. I wish they would. 4,000 people were present at the Mass in the commemoration of it. The 4,000 people saw the miracle of the sun, the same miracle of the sun that occurred at Fatima during the consecration. So I'm thinking to myself, well, wait a minute, why can't we get access to that thing? And probably because it's pretty ugly. The point being is that Our Lady obviously appears for specific reasons, and prudentially we should take a certain reasonable amount of knowledge or a reasonable amount of time to take a look at it to see, what's Our Lady telling us, because she's obviously warning us against stuff. She always shows up like a good mother to keep us from hurting ourselves, and so she's actually, we need to take a look at that. So prudentially we wait, and then when the church does give approbation, given your other duties and states in life, that you can take a look at that. Okay. We're going to stop there. They're going to collect the questions, and then we will have the Q&A. It's Trefonti. We'll start with this, and then, of course, if anybody has any further questions after we get done with these, we can answer those. What did you mention about the last apostle? Or not since the death of the last apostle. Public revelation, that is the actual formal revelation of God about those things that are necessary to believe as a Catholic, ended with the death of the last apostle. So when St. John died, that was it. Public revelation ceased. So then all the, after that, any time that Christ or Our Lady would appear is purely private in relationship to that, which means we're not bound by it. Okay. Magdalene de la Cruz supposedly was possessed at the age of 3 or a little bit older. For 30 years had church officials fooled. She then admitted after many supernatural feats that she gave her soul to the devil. How can this be when the age of reason is 7? Somebody can actually become possessed in the womb. It's a misunderstanding. Let me give you an example of how we know that to be the case. In the late 1800s in Italy, in northern Italy, there was an outbreak of possessions. And so the Vatican sent a team to do an investigation. What they discovered is that, like many Italian situations, the Italians have this kind of thing where, if one woman gets mad at another woman, she'll like curse the child or, do something like that, right? So these things were happening, and what's happened is that when the priests were doing the baptisms, they were dispensing with the exorcisms because they didn't believe that a baby could be possessed or influenced from the devil. It's just simply not the case. As I've mentioned, I actually had a case of a child who was possessed at the age of 10 months. My nickname for this little girl was Chucky the Doll. That thing was unbelievable. When the demon would manifest, you literally had to hold the thing out like this, because if you didn't, when the thing would manifest, the face would change. It's 10 months old. It hardly has any motor coordination at all, and it was literally trying to gouge your eyes out. So the point being is that they can be possessed that young, and so you have to be careful. Make sure you get your kids baptized and that the exorcisms are actually done. Regarding private revelation is lack of... Yes?
What part of the baptism are you referring to when you say the exorcism?
It's right in the beginning.
Is that the part of it?
That's actually done on the side of the... it's done on the side of the godparents, in order so that they know that the child will be raised Catholic and that they were going to do what they need to do. That's actually not... No, there's an actual set... In the old rite, there's a threefold exorcism. In the new rite, there's just one, but you have to make sure the priest doesn't dispense with it. And a lot of them have been doing that. So, regarding private revelation, is a lack of discretion a sign of a lack of authenticity? Yes, it can be. If you look at the seers, like the three children from Fatima or Bernadette, or you look at the children. Generally speaking, they have a grace to have a great deal of discretion and prudence. In fact, almost in an extraordinary fashion. Whereas when they don't, that lack of discretion is probably a sign that the person is either following their emotions or that there's something disordered there. Should people discuss their own private spiritual matters with anyone but their spiritual director? It depends. If you're looking for counsel, I'd say, stick with a priest or a spiritual director. If you're talking about, generally speaking, I think that you shouldn't really do too much revealing of what's going on in your interior life with other people unless in some manner it's going to help them. But that should be rare and few and far between. I'm always a little nervous when people are always talking about their own spiritual life interiorly to other people. How much credibility should people give to dreams? What about people who go around telling others about their own dreams or claim to interpret other people's dreams? I would ignore every single thing that person says, literally. Dreams can be from three causes. There can be dreams actually from God authentically, but they're so extraordinarily rare. I just tell people the advice of John of the Cross: ignore it. Because first of all, you don't necessarily know if it's from God or from the devil. So the best thing to do is just ignore it. And if it's God, if it's authentically from God, he's omnipotent. He'll get out of you whatever he wants, regardless of whether you pay attention or not. Whereas the devil can only get something from you if you pay attention to it. And this is one of the reasons why they cause dreams. So the first is God can be, but it's exceedingly rare. The second is that the devil can cause it, or demons can cause dreams. And there's certain characteristics that you'll see in the dreams. They're usually very vivid. They're like watching a movie. They follow a specific arc. There's a certain logic to the whole thing. They don't necessarily have to seem evil or anything like that. They're sometimes kind of weird. They'll very often leave you waking up exhausted and tired, or a little bit emotionally shaken, but not always. The third one is from ourselves. So we can have our own selves as the source of the dreams. Now, given that's the case, we can't be certain where the dreams actually come from. So I tell people, ignore them. Just ignore it. You don't need to know. If God wants you to really know something, He can do it outside of a dream. What does a layperson do when someone is claiming to have private revelations, but the layman has serious doubts about the authenticity of the visions? I would just tell him, you need to go to a spiritual director, talk to him, and don't talk to anybody else about them until he thinks that they should be properly investigated and signs off on them. So I tell him. Like I said, I'm always nervous when people are kind of running around always trying to say, Jesus spoke to me and he said this. This is one of the reasons why when people say, well, Jesus said to me or the Lord said to me, I'm like, well, wait a minute, did you hear a voice or did you hear something else or what was it? No, I just got this grace. Okay, let's be more precise in how we're talking here. So I'm always a little nervous with, especially with some of the Protestant preachers. Jesus said to me, really? Are you hearing his voice? Are you? And by the way, if you're hearing voices, maybe we should talk a little bit. Okay. How do you know if you have possession? Most people who are possessed know there's something not quite right. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're hearing voices, although they could be. It doesn't necessarily mean that they feel anything interiorly. They just know that that there's something not quite right with them. Possession the demons don't always manifest themselves in possession in a preternatural way until you get to sessions. What does that mean? One case that I worked with a woman, she had been possessed since the time she was 6 and didn't know it. All she knew is that after that she was never quite the same, and that through her teenage years she was rebellious. And of course there's all these problems. And when she came to me, she was suffering from a particular kind of a difficulty that seemed to be kind of coming and going. And I said, there's this blessing, let me give you this blessing. And so during the blessing, I did it with her about 3 times, and then there were some things that were kind of like, this is looking like it's a manifestation, but it's not preternatural. At least it's something that some human could fake, but it could be. And then later, boom, he did manifest. She didn't even know it, that she was possessed. But usually people who are possessed will actually know it. Now some people say, well, I used to be involved in Wicca. How do I know I didn't become possessed? Well, there's a very simple way. Demons are showmen. They can't hide themselves. They just have to show up, right? Because they're so self-absorbed. So what'll happen is at some point they'll kind of rear their ugly head. And so I'll tell people, well, after you did that, did you feel different? Did your life change after that in a way that you just were never quite the same? And if they said yes, then okay, well then maybe there's something there, maybe. But the ultimate way that you can only really know if you're possessed is you have to have a priest pray over you and see if he can force it to the surface. If there's nothing there, it won't surface. If it does, buckle down, okay. Are fairy tales okay? When would witches and fairies be good to have in stories versus dangerous? Okay, first, fairy tales, depends on what you mean by fairy tales. If you're talking about real fairies, I would say, not until the kid gets a certain degree of discretion. But you can use fairy tales in the sense of things that are children's stories that are fictitious, that might involve creatures that aren't real, for the sake of teaching the child some type of moral lesson. There's nothing that says that you can't do that. Obviously, you have to take, well, there's not really, there is no real truth fairy. So, eventually at some point you have to explain to the child that it's not there. When it comes to witches, it depends. I mean, like in Hansel and Gretel, that whole thing. I'm like, well, I don't have a problem with that story if someone wants to read it to their kid. I mean, even though there's a witch in it or there's other things in these things, I don't have a problem with that as long as the witch is portrayed as this evil person and there's not these real spells being done in the book and etc. So it just depends on it. I think that what's happened is in the past people didn't pay that much attention to it because most of that stuff was, it wasn't that dangerous. It wasn't dangerous. But then now that we are full blown into an occult society where there's occult stuff happening, people are involved in witchcraft, you got the Satanists trying to put up their statues of Baphomet and all this other nonsense. The fact of the matter is that now people have kind of gone to the other extreme where they're a bit too sensitive about it. And I'm just like, look, just let the thing speak for itself. If it's dangerous, it's dangerous. If it's not, it's not. I wouldn't worry too much about it. I mean, if they're portraying witchcraft as a good thing and trying to encourage kids to do it and putting spells in the books, I'd say I'd keep it away from my kid. But on the other hand, if it's just, the fairy tale, like Peter Pan or something, I wouldn't worry about it. All right. Yeah, well, Harry Potter's a different matter because the spells are real. And there's a whole history of Harry Potter that is a problem. And besides, the moral stories in Harry Potter are actually bad, which is the ends justify the means. That's the moral of the stories. Okay. In what ways can a husband bless his wife? Only generally or for a specific purpose in mind? Well, the custom is, or the tradition is that he can bless her by just making the sign of the cross on her forehead and say, God bless you. He can just say it, etc. And that's usually how it's done. If it's for a particular purpose in mind, like if she's traveling, he can say, God bless you and may God keep you safe. He can do something like that. But it's not only priests use what's called constitutive blessings, where you're blessing people for very specific things. Usually as the husband, it's just a general blessing. When someone is trying to grow in virtue, how many areas should someone be working on at a time, and how should someone determine where to start? That's a very good question. And the question is, and this is the actual answer. Teresa of Avila said that you should pick one vice and work on it, and then once you conquer it, move to the next. So how do you figure out? So I don't recommend that people are, well, I'm fasting 7 days a week on bread and water for this thing, and then, and by the way, over here I'm flagellating myself for this thing, and over here, no, look. Focus on one thing, conquer it, and get rid of it. Now, how do you know which is what you should start on? The one that's the predominant fault. And what's a predominant fault? It's the one that's usually the worst, not always, but it's usually the worst, and the predominant fault is one from which other faults flow. So if you have, like for example, if your problem is that you're lazy, and as a result of that, anytime anybody suggests something that maybe you should get off the couch, and you get angry with them, and then you go to confessions, Father, I have a real problem with anger. That may be, but your real problem is you're lazy. So get off the couch. Okay. Now, how do I know which one that should be? Sometimes we can just do an interior recollection of it. You can ask your guardian angel to show it to you. He knows what your problems are. He's got to deal with them. But the most effective way to find out what your defect is pray a novena to Our Lady of Sorrows, specifically under that title, and ask her to reveal to you what is the defect that I need to work on, what's the one that's underlying the most. And very often she will reveal to you things that you had never had anticipated. Okay. Sometimes people say, boy, that was brutal, when they found out what their real problem is. How should a family respond to the growing toxicity of the culture? How does someone determine how much a child should be exposed to as a child and they are growing up? How should a parent address different topics? Okay, first the first part. Exposure to a problem is based upon the ability of the person to process the issue, the problem. When a child is before the age of 6, you do not expose him practically to anything that could be detrimental, because he doesn't have the sufficient use of reason in order to be able to process it. Well, between the ages of 6 and 12, or before they go through puberty, you might be talking a little bit about some problems, especially if there's some kind of family issues or things like that, you can talk about them. And in relationship to the society, you basically need to make sure that their access to the internet is filtered and all that, and that they actually, that you're still protecting them in large part, but you may have to start introducing some of the more minor issues at the beginning. After puberty, provided your child has sufficient virtue, you need to start addressing the graver problems in the society. I'm sorry, but by the time your child reaches 18, he better understand what's wrong with gay marriage now. He better understand what's wrong with people living and shacking up. He better understand what's wrong with divorce and remarriage without annulments. He better understand all this stuff, because if not, the minute he walks out of there, he's just going to get whacked, and he's not going to know how to deal with it. So he needs to actually know about that, and that means the parents have to introduce the topics and talk about the topics in such a manner that's suitable to his capacity or her capacity, and talk about them so that they actually understand it by that time. Your goal as a parent is to get the child to the age of 18 with sufficient maturity to basically navigate in the culture, and that means that you're going to have to prepare them rather significantly here. One of the things that you can do too, though, is that when the kids are young, I mean, you just basically say, no, John, you can't do that. That's wrong, right? But when they get to a certain age, you start talking about why things are morally right and wrong. That is when they have use of reason. And then as they're going through puberty and things of that sort, you should be introducing them into more extensive, like, examinations of conscience so they understand, or going through some type of moral textbook that's for some of the homeschoolers that will begin to lay out what the virtues are and what the vices are and what the problems are, so that when the child gets to a certain age, he actually understands what's morally right and wrong, and the why of it. Not just that he knows, that fornication's immoral. He needs to know why it's immoral, so that in the end, he doesn't just say, well, that's just mom and dad and everybody else is doing it, so I'm going to do it. How should a parent address different topics? There's two principles: the nature of the topic and the capacity of the child to process the topic. So you just have to look at the topic and wait. So if you're talking about matters that pertain to the 6th and 9th commandment, you don't talk to your kid who's 5. You wait until the kid is, getting a little bit older, 8, 9, 10, depending on the child, and where those questions start coming up, because kids start wondering, hey, where do babies come from? Telling them the stork isn't particularly helpful. Okay, so at some point you're going to have to introduce it. Now you may have to delay, he may ask the question, but you may have to delay it because you realize he's just not ready to hear this. Okay. Where is the balance between prudence, protecting and providing for your family, and relying on divine providence? Oh, that's a whole conference in itself. Okay. First of all, prudence is the application of right reason to the concrete circumstances, so prudence itself should be able to tell you all of this. If you're really prudent, you'd already know. So protecting your family, again, it's a matter of levels and degrees. One of the biggest mistakes I find is people are protecting their children all the way until they're 18, and these kids literally don't know the first thing about the culture, or know very little about the culture, and haven't had any interaction with it. One of the things is, if your child is of sufficient maturity and virtue, you may want to have them take on a job that has to have where they have their contact with people is somewhat limited, but they still have contact with people, so they have to start learning how to process these things. One of the reasons you want to do it before they leave home is because then through counsel you can help them to know this is the proper thing to do. So the balance, again, is it's a matter of looking at the circumstances. I have to look at the child, look at the stuff we're dealing with, look at the nature of the thing we're kind of dealing with, and see how does this all kind of come together. Is it easy? Not really. But if you ask God for the grace to do it and depend upon Him, He'll let you know. As far as providing for your family and relying on divine providence, the church has always said that you can expect that if you're baptized Catholic, that God will provide ordinary graces through the course of your life to save your soul. And the same applies to your children. So you can rely on divine providence for the ordinary things of life, basically. But when it comes to certain things that are extraordinary, you are not to presume that God will give you the grace in those times. So you don't take your kid who's 14 and throw him in a brothel and say, God will provide the grace for you to navigate this situation. It ain't going to happen, right? Okay. The point being is that you have to develop prudence. But that's why I was mentioning last night. Prudence is developed by never sinning. The people who never sin, in my experience, can usually fall upon the right thing. And being faithful to grace. God will give you the grace to see what's wrong as long as you depend upon it. But if you try and control it, He's not going to give you the grace, because He realizes there's no point in throwing pearls before swine, because you're not going to accept it. What are some of the most common pitfalls for women? I think that the principal defect, that if a woman can conquer this, if she can conquer this one defect, she will excel in all other areas of her spiritual life. And that is not controlling her husband. Because the controlling of her husband is the violation of every moral virtue. Every moral virtue. It's against prudence because you're not the head. It's against justice, you're usurping his authority. It's against fortitude because you're basically following the weakness of your emotions and wanting to control him to get out what you want out of him. And it's obviously against temperance because you're trying to indulge yourself by making him do what you want to do so you feel good about yourself. So if a woman can conquer that, there's no other area of her life that she can't conquer. I've seen this over and over again. Women who manage to conquer that and just give that up, their acceleration into holiness is so rapid, it's just astounding. And you can tell it because they're peaceful, they're happy, etc. For men, I think that there's two things that men have to, I think, primarily work on. I think they have to work on avoiding effeminacy, being soft, which you heard me give the conference here, which, by the way, has turned out to be quite the conference on the internet. Not to be bragging, but it was just one of those things where everyone's like, how come we've never heard this before? And I'm like, this isn't rocket science. Okay. The second thing is chastity. Most men suffer from difficulties in the area of chastity. And so if they can conquer that, those are the ones that they can really advance in the most rapidly. What should a man do who has grown up without good role models but is trying to understand what it means to be a man and how to do so? Well, listen to the conference I gave, but also Fulton Sheen talks a little bit about the maturation process in one of his conferences. I also think when it comes to role models, what you have to do is you have to start reading the lives of the saints and other people who are heroic so that you get a sense of it. If you don't have it in your own life, then you need to learn self-sacrifice, which you learn through the martyrs and through saints or through men who went to war, went to battle, or the saints who, or the guys who did things that were, quite valiant. That's how you learn that sense of self-sacrifice. When it comes to being responsible, you basically need to find a prudent man who takes good care of his family, who loves his family, takes good care of them, provides for them, etc., and so that he can actually help you to see that. But if they don't have any role models, you got to dig the role models out of the textbooks. Okay. What did you say was the name of the apparition that occurred in 1947? It's the apparition at the Tre Fontane. We don't know what Our Lady's title is when she appeared there because the whole apparition is literally sealed. So we don't know. Why haven't any of the popes consecrated Russia? I think there's a whole variety of reasons. Some of it boils down to the fact that the Russians, the communists, rumor has it that the communists threatened persecution of the priest if it was done. Sometimes I think it was done just through human respect. At a certain stage, I think now, in the post-conciliar, I just don't think they believe it. I don't think they believe in the apparition, frankly. Or they don't believe you have to pay any attention to it. So I think I think there's a whole variety of different reasons. It really ultimately boils down to one thing, though, and that is no pope has consecrated Russia because no pope has had the grace to consecrate Russia, because we haven't prayed and done our part to merit that. That's why. Based on what you said about the seer interpreting the vision improperly, is it possible for Medjugorje to be authentic? Well, I think that's one of those things that we have to wait for the church to make a final judgment. As I mentioned, Medjugorje, the three prior bishops, have said there's nothing authentic happening there. We need to wait till Rome makes the final judgment. Did the church approve the stigmatist Catalina from Bolivia? I'll admit my ignorance, I have no idea. There's so many of these things that are starting to kind of come to light. There's so many different apparitions occurring, it's hard to know all of them as well. When Jesus drove the demons into the pigs, I always felt sorry for that guy, by the way. He lost his whole herd, right? Yeah, there you go. When Jesus drove the demons into the pigs, did this have anything to do with the Old Testament view on not eating pork? No, it didn't. Actually, what it had to do, because Christ actually lifted the restriction on pork, what it had to do with is two things. There was two things that were taught. One is that the disposition of the demons is entirely in the hands of Christ. He's the one who determines where they go. This is why even in sessions when you're dealing with possession, you actually remand the demon to the foot of the cross, and Christ is the one who determines what happens to him, ultimately. The second thing is, because even as an exorcist, you don't have the authority to tell the demon where he is to go. You might have the authority to cast him out, but you don't have the authority to tell him where to go. Only Christ does. The second thing is that it was to give us knowledge that demons can possess animals and inanimate objects as well, other than just human beings. Also, I suppose in a secondary or a tertiary way, he was also teaching us that when demons leave people, they can go somewhere else. They can be a bit of a problem. As a parent, should my kids be friends with kids whose families read and like Harry Potter? I think it depends. I mean, it's one thing if they're watching the movies and reading the books all the time, and they're constantly talking about it, I'd say I'd get them away from there. But if it's the type of thing that they've read the books, they liked them, etc., but they don't really pay that much attention to them, I would say I wouldn't worry about it. But if they become fans and devotees of it, I wouldn't have them hanging around. Is it prudent to stock up on food supplies for the economic hardship, or should someone only keep what they need now? Okay. There's two parts to it. The first is that you have to trust in the providence of God regardless of whether you got food or not. And why is that the case? Because you don't know if you are going to suffer the full effects of the chastisements, or what degree of the effects of the chastisement that's coming down the pike. You don't know. So ultimately, then people say, well, should I have food? Well, I think you should have a certain amount of food anyway, just as a matter of prudence. I mean, if the power goes out for 6 weeks or something like that, or something happens and there's no food that's brought in, you better have something. Should you have food for a year? If you can afford it, yeah. You're going to have to rotate your stock out, etc., and make sure, unless you buy those ones that are good for 25 years. But you should have some. I think it's generally prudence, given the nature of where things are headed. But my point is don't think that by having the food that you're safe. That's the thing. For two reasons. One, when people see you aren't starving, you better have ammo along with that food. The second thing is you better be sure that you recognize that, something could happen. You could be traveling on a trip somewhere and all of a sudden, woof, up goes the nuclear weapon and all this food sitting in your house for your neighbors to eat. All right. So having that stuff, it's a good precaution. Just don't think it's going to make you safe. Is ballet okay? Ballet, okay. I know it is fine art. That's what I was going to say. As an art form, it's fine. But is there a problem with modesty? It depends. It depends on what they're wearing. As far as all that goes. Are there certain motions that they make? Maybe some of them. But I think if they're dressed modestly, it's not an issue. But it's really all about the principles of modesty and how they would actually apply to that. I'm personally not that big of a fan of although I do have a certain admiration for people who can stand on their toes like that. All right. In regards to the 6th and 9th commandment, when you do start talking to a child about, when do you start talking about the child dressing modestly? Pope Pius XI said, at the tenderest years. You know what year that is? 2. You start like, for instance, everybody's seen this. Little kid, he's 2 years old. Usually it's a boy. The girls don't do this, but usually the boys will all of a sudden, you're cleaning them up. All of a sudden, boom, they bolt out and they go running around the house naked, right? And you're like, okay, look, you got to tell them, no, you don't do that, right? So they start. As far as the church is concerned, especially with girls, you should start teaching them to be modest immediately. That is, as soon as the child gets to the point where they can start dressing themselves or has any sense of dressing themselves or being dressed, you need to start teaching them very young. Just tell them. Now, obviously, the reasons you reveal behind that will get deeper and change over the course of time. But immediately you just say, no, we don't do that, at least initially. And that's a really important point, because I find that if it's engendered in the younger years, there's already a sense of it even in the older years, even if they're not following necessarily. They're in the back of their mind, no, this isn't right. What are the common American behaviors, beliefs that most faithful Catholics should not easily recognize as sinful? Boy. I'd have to think a little bit about that one. I'm not real sure. Let me think a little bit about it. What do you think of Elizabeth Kindelman of Hungary? It's another one of those people I don't know much about. You know, you would think me being in this business I'd have a better sense of these people, but there's so many of these I just really don't know. I just haven't had the time. Part of it is that, you know, people will ask me, well, have you read this book, and have you read that book, and read this book, you know, and it's usually some, recent book that some authors put out, and it's a bestseller. I'm like, nah, I haven't read that book. Nah, I haven't read that book either. I'm like, well, what are you reading? Well, quite frankly, my time is limited to read, so if I'm going to read something, I'm going to read the Saints. I'm going to read some formal theological tract. I'm not going to read, you know, what Joe Schmuck tends to think about the Hillary Clinton or something. I'm just not interested, right? It just doesn't really mean too much. But sorry, getting back to this. I just don't know that much about it. It's hard for me to keep track of all these, all the people. What I need to do is get something on my iPad so that, what do you think of so-and-so? I'll let you know. And then look it up. Okay. All right. You know, I think the common American behaviors or beliefs that most faithful Catholics would not easily recognize as sinful. I think there's a few of them, and I think most of them revolve around the area of modesty. That's putting aside that I think that I do not think that the primary American vice are sins against chastity. I think that the primary American vice is greed, which is why we are slowly becoming communist. When the economy is the most important topic of discussion among the politicians, we have already ceded to the communists their principle. That's a problem. There's other areas that are far more important, like obviously abortion, the fact that we have this moral collapse, we've got gay marriage, we've got all this stuff that obviously our kids are getting out of high school and they can't even read. I mean, it's just the whole thing is a mess. So, but as far as the American behaviors, I think the primary things have to do with modesty. And this is, partly it has to do with how people dress, but I think, because I've noticed that even some faithful Catholics, not necessarily traditional Catholics, but even some of them, some of the stuff they wear, you're just like, whoa, you know, you go to communion in that? So I think that there's that, but I think it also has to do with, you know, there's a lot of hidden things in our culture that are just disordered. For example, the idea that you should get to express yourself in certain circumstances and nobody should get to stop you is actually a sin against modesty. Because a person who's modest recognizes there are certain principles about when you do and do not say something, and you don't have a right to express yourself if it's contrary to the common good. The second thing is I think there's a lot of curiosity in our culture. You know, people who spend hours on the internet, 99% of the time, that's just idleness, feeding the vice of curiosity. You don't need to know 90% of the stuff that's on there. And this is one of the things where there's just an enormous amount of time. Obviously, effeminacy, I think, is a gargantuan problem in our culture, even among faithful Catholics, even among traditional Catholic men. I think it's just gargantuan. So I think that's one of the problems. I think also there's also other violations of modesty in relationship to speech, where people think it's really hip to speak in terms and ways that, you know, that the people who are the most recent, the avant-garde of speech are culcating and bringing up. I think that's a problem. I also think that it's a sin against modesty, this constant texting in front of everybody around people, because basically it's also a sin against circumspection, because you're not paying attention to what's circumspection is when you keep track of your surroundings. Well, as soon as you start doing that, you're not paying attention to your surroundings. It also is kind of a sin against justice, because basically what you're telling is, and you see this, you're basically telling the people that you're around that they're not worthy of your attention. So I think there's a lot of stuff that's creeping in. I think those are some of the more pervasive things. I think that some of the hidden things, which I know as a priest and as an exorcist, that are huge, that a lot of people don't seem to understand or know that is actually there, is that the amount of sex in manners that are contrary to nature among the people under the age of 18 is so huge and off the charts that most people would stagger if they knew how bad it was. So that's a huge problem in the lurking that's coming down later. Obviously, the problem with pornography. In this country, at any one given time, 50% of the bandwidth that goes through the internet is pornography. So there's other issues. Another issue that's lurking in the background that's going to come to really bite us is the number of kids under the age of 18 getting involved in the occult. And I'm not talking just dabbling. We're talking seriously getting involved in it. So there's certain problems that are coming up on the horizon that unless God punishes us or corrects us, I think it's going to be a problem. When during a discussion someone starts pointing out specific people as examples of how people should not act, what should the listener's response be? I think it depends on the individual they're pointing out. You really shouldn't act like St. Augustine like he did when he was younger. There's nothing wrong with that. Okay. Whereas if it is, if someone says, I have a real problem with anger. Yeah, you don't want to be like Joe Schmuck next door. That guy's so obnoxious. You should see what he obviously not. In other words, if it's public knowledge about a person's behavior, you can point it out, and there's not necessarily any sin involved. But the one thing you want to keep in mind is this. St. Thomas says, St. Thomas asks the question, can you say something bad about somebody? And he says you have to meet 3 conditions. You may do so if you meet 3 conditions. 1, it has to be just. It can't be worse than it is, not necessarily less than it is, but you can't exaggerate. It has to be proportionate to what he actually did. 2nd, it has to proceed from charity, which means it's actually for the spiritual betterment of yours or for the person you're telling. 3rd, it has to be necessary. And that's the one that most people don't get. I love this when people come in and they'll say, Father, I don't want me to gossip, but I want you to pray for I'm only telling you this because I want you to pray for so-and-so, and then for 20 minutes they're trying to tell you everything this person's done that's wrong. I don't need to hear that. All you need to do is come into me and say, Father, would you please pray for so-and-so? Sure, that's all I need to hear. So you only need to know. Now, there's certain times you may need to tell them. So, for example, if your daughter is dating some guy who's just evil, you have to sit her down and say, he's just evil. So, and that may be what you have to do. But generally, just as a general rule, make sure you meet those 3 requirements, and then you're okay. Okay. Any other questions before we wrap it up? Yes.
Okay, I'm something for you. How can you ever know what's for God, what's for the devil?
Well, it depends on what you're talking about. I mean, if you're talking about like in dreams and things like that, you just ignore all that stuff and just lead your Catholic life. If you're talking about apparitions, you just wait to the judgment of the magisterium. Obviously there are certain things in your life that you're going to begin to realize that this is diabolic because there's just certain things happening. For example, somebody's trying to destroy your family's finances or something. The person who's trying to do that may not be possessed, but you do know that this is disordered and evil. We will stop there, and if you kneel, I will give you a blessing. Benedictio Dei omnipotentis, Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, super vos et manet semper. Amen.
Amen.